video series. My name is Pastor Sam. I'm so glad that you've joined me on today. Listen, I'm going to teach you about the life of Jesus. That's exciting. The life of Jesus. Follow me, likes, shares, comments, subscribes. Just interact with me. Contact me on social media through direct messaging. If you want to learn how you can partner with me, I have a nonprofit organization. I also offer merchandise. That's pretty cool, isn't it? So if you just want to be a blessing to me, I trust you will. Again, the best way is just to watch my videos and like, share, comment, subscribe. But also you can partner with me. Without further delay, let's get started. In other videos, we talked about the incarnation of Jesus. Jesus existed before time. We talked about Jesus' birth in modern-day Palestine. Jesus was fully Middle Eastern. Jesus was born Yeshua. That's a Hebrew name. It means salvation of God. Jesus had brothers and sisters. Jesus loved his mother. Jesus grew up in Egypt. Jesus lived in a region we call Galilee, which was actually modern-day Syria, Lebanon. Again, fully Middle Eastern. Jesus was baptized around the age of 30. That began his ministry. Then he started to choose his disciples. That's what we're talking about now, by the way. As soon as Jesus was baptized by his cousin John the Baptist, he started choosing his disciples. Jesus performed miracles. Jesus did a lot of incredible things. He had encounters with everyday people. And so we're now going to talk about how Jesus chose his 12 trusted advisors. On last video, we talked about Peter was the first of those 12 who Jesus chose. Oh, by the way, one of those 12 went bad. We called him Judas, but we'll talk about him towards the end. So now as we move higher, we're going to talk about the next disciple that Jesus chose, and his name is John. As I mentioned in my previous video, we're not necessarily teaching about these disciples in any specific chronological order, but in a sense of how much we know about them, which in a sense kind of leads or lends to their prevalence and importance. Listen, all of us are important. The first video we talked about as this disciple series began was Peter. One thing I forgot to mention about Simon Peter was that Peter actually was not only instrumental in the church as we know it today, which is simply teaching others about his best friend Jesus, but he did it by writing some very important books of the Bible. So he actually wrote a couple of books in the Bible, as well as he was instrumental in some of the other books being written. So he was very, very important. Well, now we're talking about John. We're taught historically, even though it's never quite mentioned in the Bible, that this particular John, oh, by the way, there was a lot of Johns, so don't get confused. But this particular John was a disciple of Jesus, but also Jesus' first cousin. So that means that Jesus, John, the Apostle John, and John the Baptist were all related. So you may say, that's kind of fishy. I think it's incredible because if anybody is going to be hard on us, it's our family. So if somebody was trying to run a hustle, if this was a game Jesus was running, I don't think he would have been able to run this game with his first cousin. Somebody would have been a snitch and told. So the fact that Jesus' very own family members, including his mom, including eventually his brothers, and I would even argue probably his sisters, the people closest to Jesus were the ones that were actually teaching that he was the Son of God and that he was perfect. How many of our families would say to anybody, man, that dude was special, man. He was perfect. He came straight from God. And that lets us know that Jesus was indeed very. This particular John, again, had a brother named James. James also followed Jesus. We'll talk about James next. So John was actually so important that he was called the beloved, simply meaning he was the youngest of all the 12. And Jesus had a special affection for him. Maybe it was because he was his cousin. Maybe it was because he was young. Maybe because he just saw his heart. That's what I believe. I believe that God incarnate in Jesus just saw John's heart. Saw that he was a good man. He was a good person. Well, why do I say that? Because there's several instances in the Bible where we're told that John is the disciple of love. John wrote the book of John, which really probably is the most fascinating teaching about Jesus, because he actually teaches about Jesus energy and light being that of God. Obviously, we know Jesus is not God, because God is just energy. But we do believe, and I do believe, and Christians, mostly the intelligent ones, believe that Jesus is the perfect light. In other words, he came from God, which is a perfect light, which is a perfect energy, which is a source unknown, but obviously it's here. It's the source of all light. Well, we don't know how, why, and when, and where, but we do believe that God's perfect energy and light came into the one we call Jesus. John witnessed that, and he actually taught that. I encourage each of you to read the book of John. I think you get the best understanding about who Jesus is in the context of the universe and in our everyday lives. We're told that the Apostle John was a good friend of Jesus, not just his cousin, not just a disciple, but he was there. He was one of the trusted ones. We see that when Jesus transfigured, remember we talked about it, Jesus going into the mountain, guess what? He took his 4 dogs with him. How many of us got some road dogs? How many of us got 2 or 3 Ace Boone Coons that we'll call anytime? They'll ride with us no matter what. All they got to do is say, hold up, let me get my wig. Hey, hold up, dude, let me get my sneakers. Hold up, let me put the kids to bed. Whatever it is, they're going to be there for us. That's who John was to Jesus. I'll be there with you. You don't have to worry about me backstabbing you, lying on you, calling you names, trying to sleep with your woman and all this other type of stuff. Listen, I got you. I love you. You love me. We're going to rock together. That's how John was. John and his brother James and Simon and Andrew was Jesus' trusted 4. They was there with Jesus during the transfiguration. They was there with Jesus, raised a little girl from the dead. They was there with Jesus so many times over and over and over and over again. They proved their worth. They proved their value. And unfortunately for them, it cost them their lives. Now, we're told that John actually was one of the only disciples that did not die. But after Jesus did die, and it's amazing as Jesus was dying, this shows you how cold-blooded John was to Jesus. As Jesus is dying, he says to his cousin John, the apostle, woman, this is thy son, son, this is thy woman. And in other words, this is thy mother. In other words, Jesus was saying to his own mother, because his mother was there watching him die, and John, the apostle, was too. He basically told John to take care of my moms. Man, look out for her. Ain't that good? That's a word right there. You really got to trust somebody to say to him, look out to my mama for me. We're told that after Jesus died, Peter and John was one of the first to see him risen. So Jesus trusted them enough to let him see him in this new form. Jesus trusted John enough to trust him with the keys to the church. Not so much like with Peter, because Peter was older and more seasoned and more boisterous. But essentially, John was a great teacher. John wrote several books in the Bible, which, of course, is one of the greatest works that we have in human history. I encourage you to read them, particularly the one that stands out the most, I think, in most people's lives is Revelation. Remember that book about Armageddon and Doomsday and everything that people are talking about right now? John is the one who wrote that. As a matter of fact, he wrote that book while he was in exile. He did not end up being killed as we think of like the other disciples would have, but he was exiled for his faith and his belief. In other words, he was put away on an island and basically in solitary confinement in prison. And so that's where he wrote the book of Revelation. It's only where he probably wrote some of the other books. I encourage you to read these books. I encourage you to learn more about John. He's an incredible. The next disciple we're going to talk about is James. James was the brother of John, who we just discussed. That would have made him also Jesus' cousin. We're told, oh, by the way, that Peter, John, and James and Andrew, who we'll discuss next, were followers of John the Baptist. Remember, we talked about that when we talked about Peter. So as far as it relates to John and James, they were brothers, and they also were Jesus' cousin, and they also were followers of John the Baptist, who was also Jesus' cousin, and who raised. The next disciple we're going to talk about is James. James, remember, was the brother of John, which also would have made James Jesus' cousin, as well as, we didn't talk about it, but John and James were also followers of John the Baptist, who was Jesus' cousins, along with Peter and Andrew, who were brothers. And oh, by the way, John and James were both fishermen. As a matter of fact, we find out in Scripture that John and James, the disciples of Jesus, who were also the disciples of John the Baptist, who were also cousins of Jesus and cousins of John the Baptist, were also in business with Peter and Andrew, who was also disciples of John the Baptist, who was Jesus' cousin, and also became the followers of Jesus himself. So these top four, and we'll get to the fourth one in a little bit, but actually we just did we'll get to the fourth one in a little bit with Andrew, but John and James and Simon, Peter and Andrew were Jesus' top four advisors. We're told that James was a very faithful servant of God, a very faithful servant to Jesus. He actually did very miraculous things. We're told that his mother, which of course would have been John's mother as well, was one of Jesus' trusted followers. So that means he came from a great family where your mom's was a follower of Jesus. That's pretty cool. Again, we're told that they were fishermen, him and his brother, and that their dad was a fisherman, that actually they were in business with their dad in a fisherman business. And we're told that Jesus came to them just like he went to Simon and says, I will now make you fishers of men. I'm glad that you are a fisherman. James was there with Jesus and Simon and Andrew and his brother John when Jesus was transfigured. So he was one of those top four. Remember, he was there with Jesus when they raised the little girl from the dead, when there were people who doubted Jesus. So Jesus only took those he trusted the most. You'll find that about God. You find that about Jesus. Oh, you have little faith. If you have very little faith, you'll probably have very little results in your prayer life. But if you have great faith, you want to surround yourself with others who have great faith. They will strengthen your faith, and you'll find out that your walk will be a lot better when you surround yourself with like-minded people. That's a word for somebody. And Jesus knew that. He surrounded himself with the tightest of the tight. Those top four, James being one of those. We're told that James and John actually got angry and wanted to call down fire from heaven. They showed you that they had a little power in their hands too. Jesus gave them some power. We talked about that before. And so Jesus says to them, don't do that, man. That ain't cool. So we're also told that James was very instrumental in spreading the gospel of Jesus Christ. Unfortunately, we're told that James was murdered soon after Jesus died and was resurrected. As a matter of fact, he was one of the first disciples to be killed. So that shows you that his faith was very strong. And so we've talked about Peter, we've talked about John, we've talked about John's brother James, these top three. Now we're going to talk about Andrew. The apostle Andrew would have been the fourth. Actually, according to the Bible tradition and the way you read scriptures, actually he probably was the actual very first disciple chosen by Jesus. He definitely was a top four. Remember again, Simon, Peter, and Andrew were brothers. They were also followers of John the Baptist, Jesus' cousin, as well as John and James. These top four were actually John the Baptist's disciples. But when John the Baptist baptized Jesus and said to them, this is the Messiah we've been reading about, so he's the one I've been teaching about, so you don't really need to follow me no more. Go to the one who, is higher than me. These four then went and followed Jesus. We're told in some, discrepancies of chronological order how did it happen. Did Jesus literally say to them, come follow me? Either way, we know that these top four, including Andrew, who we're discussing today, were very faithful. We don't know a lot about them as much as we know about Simon, but to be mentioned in the Bible alongside Jesus and to be mentioned as one of his most faithful, one of his most strong, we find that, again, he was a brother to Peter. He's the one that actually went to Peter and said to Peter, I found him. That's good. How many of us can say we found him? How many of us, when we find a good thing, go to somebody else and say, hey, this is a good thing. Come follow me. Let me show you. Let me introduce you to this good thing. Now, that's what Andrew did. He introduced his brother and ultimately the world to Jesus because of his faith and his belief. Andrew went on again to be a very trusted advisor of Jesus. He was there with Jesus when Jesus performed many of the miracles, particularly the miracles of feeding of the fish. He was there when Jesus transfigured. He was there when Jesus performed a lot of miracles, as well as a lot of disciples were. But we'll find that they were top four. Those top four we've discussed already. And so those were the ones who were closest to Jesus. What does that mean? What is that significance in what I'm teaching you and what you may be hearing? That means that all of us are, the Bible says many are called, few are chosen. In other words, a lot of us hear the word. Some of it falls just on deaf ears. In other words, we just ignore it. Some of us, it sounds good to us, but there's nothing really in us to make us gravitate to it or feed into it or want to know more. But then some of us hear it and it's just a great word and we just seek it out and we want more and we read and we study. And now we're even maybe teaching it ourselves. So that's how Andrew was. That's how Simon was. That's how James and John was. They were not only believers, but they were his top believers. They were his top soldiers. And so what an incredible story it is to know that Andrew, the son of a fisherman himself, a businessman himself, probably the very first follower of Jesus Christ, introduced his brother, and the story goes on, of course, and we know how it ends. Unfortunately, we are told that Andrew would have met his demise after Jesus was, of course, killed himself and resurrected. And as Peter started the church and Andrew was instrumental in that, we do find that unfortunately Andrew was murdered. But before that, we're told that he was instrumental in spreading the gospel, as Jesus taught his disciples, teach ye all nations my name, and teach them what I've taught you, and baptize them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. And they did that. They went to all nations. These 12 are responsible for really each and every one of us outside of Palestine, outside of Israel, even knowing who God is. That's incredible. The next disciple we're going to discuss is Matthew. Matthew, of course, wrote one of the most important books of the Bible, Matthew. And so this particular book was written by Matthew. We're told that Matthew, again, was one of the second of the four. So remember, the first four was Andrew, Peter, James, and John. And the second of the four would have been Matthew, Philip, Thomas, and Nathaniel. And so Matthew was a tax collector, which in those days would have mean he was seen as evil, pure evil. He would have been thought of like as a thief, even though he was Jewish. But he was despised, and we find that a lot of the controversy that followed Jesus was Jesus' particular affinity for hanging out with normal folk. In other words, Matthew would have been one of those normal folk. Matthew was not a follower of John the Baptist. Matthew was not particularly seen as religious. This is a word for some of us out there. That means that Jesus didn't just pick religious people. That means that Jesus didn't just pick people who subscribe to a certain lifestyle. Matthew would have had a lifestyle that many would have said was evil, a tax collector, which seems silly to us today. But in those days, you got to recognize the culture. In those days, he would have been seen as a thief, as evil. He had a lot of money. He had a lot of influence. Isn't it amazing how Jesus chose people in his inner circle who had influence? Surround yourself with people who can elevate you, and you can elevate them as well, but not that someone's going to keep you where you used to be. Matthew was a tax collector. Jesus walked by his table where he was collecting people's money and, oh, by the way, probably keeping a little bit for himself. And Jesus says, come follow me. We're told that Matthew left all that he had. That's incredible. We hear that about Peter. We hear that about John and James. We hear that now about Matthew. The reality is all 12 probably at some point did that, because to be a disciple of Jesus meant you would have lived with him. It wasn't a part-time job. When you was a disciple of someone in those days, and it's particularly as it relates to Jesus, you would have lived with him. These all 12 men would have lived with Jesus, probably with Peter, probably in some of the more influential disciples' homes, but ultimately they spent all day, every day with Jesus for 3 years. We don't know a lot about Matthew. Again, I do think it's significant that he wrote the book of Matthew, which is a great read. I highly recommend you to read the book of Matthew. It's just probably one of the top 3 or 4 books in the Bible. So if Matthew was cold enough to write that book of the Bible, cold enough to withstand the test of time, cold enough to be basically transformed from being viewed as a sinner, as a thief to one of the most recognized spiritual men in the history of time. And then I think he's worth reading his book and getting to know him. Obviously, we don't know a lot about his personal life, his marriage, his kids, and nothing like that. We just know that he was a tax collector, that he was influential, that he was there with Jesus. Jesus ate dinner with him and his friends. I think he did follow Jesus and that he did not betray Jesus. We're also told that more than likely he did die as well after spreading the gospel in different parts of the world. We find that some of the disciples went to India. Some of them went to China. Some of them went to Tiberias. Some of them went to Indonesia. Some of them went to Armenia. Some of them went to Turkey and Syria. Some of them went to Rome. But we do know that all of the disciples, for the most part, after Jesus died, he gave them that decree to go ye therefore and teach all nations. They did just that. They literally went to every corner of the earth. Isn't that amazing? That was their calling. All these 12 disciples went to every different part of the world. It's almost like they just spread out. And unfortunately, by spreading out, they did, of course, come into some treacherous, evil folk. But before that happened, they were able to establish churches and teach others about Jesus. Matthew was no exception. We don't know exactly how he died, when and where, but church tradition tells us that he did die for Jesus. The next disciple we'll talk about is Thomas. Thomas was a twin, as indicated by the nickname Jesus gave him, Didymus. Didymus means the twin. So that was pretty interesting. Jesus chose a twin to follow him. So Jesus chose a couple of fishermen who were influential in business, and Matthew, who was influential with the government, and then a twin. And so we know Thomas primarily because of being doubting Thomas. We're told that Thomas, of course, was one of the top disciples of Jesus. He was in that second of the four, so maybe not at the top ranks, but definitely right there with Jesus from the beginning of the time. He was a ride or die. The only thing that Thomas kind of messed himself up is when Jesus died and Jesus appeared before the other disciples after he died and resurrected. Thomas was not there. Of course, Jesus planned this. So Thomas was not there. And so when they went and told Thomas, hey, we seen the Lord, we seen Jesus, he's risen. Thomas says, I'd have to see the nails, the nail prints. I'd have to see like the scars to know that's really him. And he was thinking it probably was a ghost or something. And so the next time Jesus came, he appeared and made sure he went straightway to doubting Thomas, the twin, and say, listen, feel these scars. It's me. And then Thomas says, Lord, 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 I love you. I'm sorry. Forgive me. And Jesus says, great is the faith of those who have never seen my scars and never will and believed upon me. That's a word for someone out there. We can't see God, but we can still believe in him. God honors your faith. Listen, Thomas did doubt, but Thomas went on and taught the gospel of Jesus. You can imagine he was trying to live down that mistake, and he did just that by going and teaching others about God after Jesus died. And unfortunately, he would have been murdered as well. I believe we hear, I think he died in India teaching the gospel of Jesus Christ. The next disciple we talk about was Philip. Philip was Greek. It doesn't really mean anything, but again, we just find how Jesus chose different types of people. Again, we chose a set of brothers. He chose a tax collector, influential businessman, and now he taught a twin. Or he chose a twin, then he chose a Greek. So this person would have been influential as well. We all know, Greeks and Romans were very highly intelligent, educated people. So this would have been a very influential individual. We're told that Philip also would have been and chose introduce his friend Nathaniel. So a lot of these guys knew each other, and they were actually fairly religious people. But it's amazing how Jesus did choose people who came from different walks of life. That's a word for you right there, isn't it? Not all of us have to go to seminary. Not all of us have to believe the exact same things, but God chooses us and he puts us all together for his greater work. So Philip, again, was one of Jesus' disciples. We don't know a lot about him. We know he was there with Jesus from the beginning to the end for the most part, as well as we do know that after Jesus died, he was one of the ones that ended up losing his life spreading the gospel of Jesus Christ. The next disciple we discuss is Bartholomew, or some call him Nathaniel. This was amazing because I believe this is a disciple that when Jesus called him, and oh, by the way, most of them, the Bible tells us that literally Jesus just saw them like from, across the street, and some say, hey, come here. And they like just left everything they had and went to follow Jesus. But this was an amazing one. I do believe this was the disciple. And some of you gospel readers can correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. But this was the disciple that Jesus said, I saw you sitting under that tree. In other words, Jesus said, come follow me. And he did. And Jesus basically kind of told him his history. So it kind of revealed to him that Jesus was a special character. And so, of course, the guy was just, blown away. How did you even know? But again, so I thought it was pretty interesting that these first few disciples had very interesting interactions with Jesus, as I would argue probably most of you have. I would argue that most of you probably have had quite interesting interactions. Where were you when you were called? What were you doing? Who called you? How did they call you? And how did you respond? And so we find that Nathaniel, Bartholomew, which is simply the same person, Jesus called and he answered the call. Nathaniel Bartholomew, unfortunately, would have met his end after Jesus' death as he was spreading the gospel. Now we start to talk about the last four, which really we don't have a lot of information on. We do know there was a disciple by the name of James of Alphaeus. Remember, there was James, Jesus' brother, who was actually the leader of the New Testament church in Jerusalem. This was not the same James. Of course, there was James, the brother of John, who was James, Jesus' disciple. When we already discussed earlier, no, this was a different James. There was two different James. The James of Alphaeus, we do know his mother actually was a follower of Jesus as well. So James of Alphaeus was probably a very religious Jewish man. Jesus probably picked him very, 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 very significant purpose. One, for influence and power, and also, of course, for his faith and religion. His mother was very religious. The other disciple we talk about is Simon Zelotes, which means he was a zealot. Not much to read into that, except I find it influential that more than likely this guy, again, was very religious, had very strong ties to the temples and to Jerusalem and some of the Jewish faith. And then we know about Judas. There was two different Judas. There was a Judas Iscariot, which is the betrayer, the liar, the thief. And then, of course, we know the other Judas, which was not the liar, the thief. And then, of course, after that, that concludes pretty much all of the 12 disciples. How many of us have enemies today because we confronted them and told them what they was doing wrong, or maybe we wasn't there with them when they thought we should have been there with them? The fact of the matter is Jesus was a fraud anyway, but it is amazing that Jesus said that I chose the 12 and even one of you will betray me. So Jesus was in control. He knew what was in this man's heart, but it just had to happen. And so eventually then what happened was Judas went to Jesus' sworn enemies, ratted Jesus out, told his enemies, Jesus' enemies, where Jesus would be, because they were in Jerusalem, which was not their hometown. So they had a special secret hideout, and only Judas and only Judas' followers would have known. And then Judas would have went and told the Roman soldiers and the government and the Pharisees and everybody that wanted to kill Jesus where to find Jesus. And like Jesus had said earlier, you know where to find me. Well, Judas knew where to find him, and then he betrayed Jesus with a kiss. You probably heard that in a rap song or something like that. You betrayed me with a kiss. Literally, they didn't know who Jesus was, because remember, even though Jesus was popular, it wasn't like social media where they had pictures and stuff of Jesus. They really didn't know kind of who he was. They just knew of him, especially in this particular region where he was not from. Make a long story short, it was dark, and so the way they knew who Jesus was, because they wanted to arrest the right person, they wanted an eyewitness. That's just how things worked. And Judas says, the one whom I will kiss is the one who you need to arrest. He's the one you're looking for. And Jesus said to him, will you betray me with the kiss? And he did just that. And so the soldiers arrested Jesus. Ultimately, of course, we know he went to trial and he died. But to follow the story of Judas, the betrayer, the hated one, the most evil human being on the planet, he ended up committing suicide, because when he realized that he didn't just sell out Jesus, but he sold out his friend, and he did it for 30 pieces of silver. He tried to go back on it. He tried to walk it back, but they said, this blood money. Remember, that's how the mafia talk. This blood money. In other words, you've already spent it, used it. You can't take it back now. So to finish up on the story of Judas, the betrayer, we're told that he ultimately hung himself and died. And so if you want to sell out God, that'll probably be your faith in this world or the next. Listen, I'm glad you joined me. We talked about the 12 disciples. All of them was good cats except one. Your circle is probably the same, right? So believe me, all of us are the same. Ultimately, is how we fulfill our destiny and purpose that determines how history will view us. So fortunately for most of the disciples, history viewed them quite pleasantly. It's amazing that Jesus chose these 12. We're told that he went to a mountain to pray to choose these 12. We're told that Jesus had thousands of followers now. Thousands, okay? Don't be lost on that. Jesus was not weak. He had thousands. But he particularly chose out of those thousands and out of those several hundreds, these 12 to be ultimately close to him. Basically, they all lived together and hung out. And of course, these 12 then went on to teach the gospel of Jesus Christ as we know it today. Start churches, however you want to describe it, whatever. But that's why these 12 are called disciples and apostles. And that's why they hold a special place in the Christian faith. What space do you hold and why? Are you a teacher? Are you a follower? Are you a leader? I encourage you to lead others to goodness, into the light. Be positive in your influence and in your circle. Listen, I love you. God loves you. Romans 10:9. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.